The United States has great strength and patience, but if it is forced to defend itself or its allies, we will have no choice but to totally destroy North Korea. Rocket Man is on a suicide mission for himself and for his regime. He has been very threatening, beyond a normal statement. And as I said, they will be met with fire, fury, and frankly, power, the likes of which this world has never seen before. I think without the rhetoric, it wouldn't have happened. I think without other things going along, I think the establishment of a new team was very important. They have a great team, but I think he wants to get it done. I really feel that very strongly.
From fire and fury to friends, right now President Trump is in the air making a 25-hour, 10,000-mile journey back to Washington, D.C. It has been a whirlwind few hours of nuclear negotiations, but the final results of the Singapore summit will take much longer to determine. Welcome back to Morning Joe. It's Tuesday, June 12th. Still with us, we have the president of the Council on Foreign Relations, Richard Haass, columnist and associate editor for the Washington Post, David Ignatius, and joining the conversation, Dean of the School of International Studies at the University of Denver, former U.S. Ambassador to South Korea, and former Assistant Secretary of State for East Asia, Christopher Hill, former Undersecretary of State for Political Affairs and former Special Advisor to President Clinton and Policy Coordinator on North Korea, Ambassador Wendy Sherman is with us, and former U.S. Ambassador to NATO, former State Department spokesman Nicholas Burns. He's professor of diplomacy and international relations at the Harvard Kennedy School of Government. Great group we have this hour to take a look at just what happened over the past 24 hours, Joe.
Right, and David Ignatius, I know you have a question for Ambassador Burns, but before you ask that question, I want to ask you, just at the top of the hour, what your feeling is about this statement, which is, again, it's sort of it's a non-binding, feel-good statement that allows these two leaders to come together and have a press conference. But do you see anything in there beyond that that causes you concerns or suggests actually that there's any possibility that this will be a success?
Joe, this is a beginning, as we've been saying for the first hour of our conversation. It's going to take many months and many meetings to see if this process is real in the sense of achieving the complete denuclearization that was announced as the achievement of this opening round, or the commitment of this opening round. This is an enormous triumph for Kim Jong Un, the North Korean leader. He has built a nuclear force that has been his leverage in these talks. He's stared down President Trump. The remarks about fire and fury. Kim Jong Un kept going, and he got to this point. And he has in President Trump someone who seems to have a real investment in Kim Jong Un's success. Working with him, used so many flattering terms about him. So I think what I'd like to ask our distinguished panelists, all of whom have been involved in deep diplomacy, is to help us think about the pitfalls in this process that began today and will continue going forward. And maybe I could ask Chris Hill, who was deeply involved in negotiations with North Korea, to start us off thinking about what he sees as the biggest stumbling blocks ahead as we try to flesh out this very loose initial framework agreement.
This is a very loose initial framework. Frankly, it does not really advance the ball. It doesn't go as far as previous statements. And frankly speaking, I think the next step should be Mike Pompeo sort of forgetting about this statement, chalking up this whole summit to a sort of feel-good atmospherics, and getting on with some kind of action plan. I think Mike Pompeo is going to be under the gun to kind of lay out what it is we need to do. For example, the statement says nothing at all about the regional powers. Is South Korea or is China, is Japan, are they going to be partners in this process? Are we going to carry on with a bilateral process? What's their role going to be? So a lot of questions like this. And if I were Mike Pompeo, I'd get moving on a sort of action plan, how to bring this into some negotiation. Because when you start looking at the statement, putting aside the syntactical problems and the whole thing, you'll see that it has some major problems and frankly is an invitation for the North Koreans to do nothing, or nothing I should say, in our lifetime.
Let me take the question to our other panel, starting with Nick Burns and then Wendy Sherman. Nick, as Ambassador Hill said, this is in part about our dealing with our allies. Certainly, when we think about our European allies, it's hard to remember a moment of more friction. How do you see the President, Mike Pompeo, moving forward to get allied support for the very difficult negotiations that are ahead?
Well, David, first let me say I think that there was powerful symbolism today in Singapore. I think the President, he should get some credit here for having arrived at this day, turned away from war where we were 7 or 8 months ago, and turned towards diplomacy. But I must say, I think the big question I've got, David, is does Donald Trump have the strategic patience to carry out a multi-year negotiation? He's not a famously patient person. It took 10 years from the time that President Bush started thinking about negotiating and then sanctioning Iran to what Wendy Sherman and John Kerry were able to fulfill 10 years later. It took 3 years for the U.S.-India negotiations, and that was of the friendly country, 2 acts of Congress to achieve a civil nuclear deal. This will take years, and this statement is very general. It has goals in it, but it doesn't really have a roadmap. And the key tactical questions are, can Mike Pompeo be unleashed to be a tough-minded negotiator? Can we keep South Korea and Japan with us? Is China going to help or hurt? And so I think you've got to use the allies. They have to be part of this, particularly South Korea, given the existential stakes about its future.
Ambassador Sherman, as someone who's been down this road before and who's dealt with North Korea on this very question, just 2 parts of this. First of all, the visual, the President of the United States shaking hands with Kim Jong Un, as Victor Cha said, being the first American to pierce the bubble and to get that close. Your reaction to that, and then more specifically to the contents of what we saw in the joint declaration.
Well, I certainly would agree with Nick that this is a good thing that these 2 leaders met, that it does break ice, that it does create a personal relationship. I must say I was a little taken aback by the North Korean flags and the American flag side by side. We really aren't side by side. We aren't equals to each other. And this conferred power to Kim Jong Un that I don't believe he has yet earned in terms of the respect from the United States. That's something that comes through building that relationship. As far as the agreement is concerned, I went back and looked at the previous agreements. The 1992 North-South Agreement on Joint Declaration on Denuclearization was very specific. No nukes, no facilities, inspections. The agreed framework that was done during the Clinton administration by Bob Gallucci was very specific. Close down the reactor until we get new light water reactors, non-proliferation proof. In fact, what Chris Hill did was extraordinary. The verifiable denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula, verifiable in the September 2005 deal, and it actually broke down over verification. So we have not only been here before, but we have been here before with much greater specificity. So Mike Pompeo needs to go back and understand a little bit more about history, and he needs to go forward with a team that knows what they're doing.
So Mike Pompeo did say they would take whatever they put together to the Senate. Any regrets not doing that with the Iran deal in some ways?
No regrets. The Congress did get to decide on the Iran deal. There hasn't been a treaty agreed to except a follow-on new start to the START treaty for years now in the Senate. When Bob Dole, the former leader of the Senate, sat in his wheelchair on the floor of the United States Senate to try to get the disabilities treaty through, who could be against a disabilities treaty? It didn't happen. So treaties are difficult. And the other thing about these very complicated reciprocal agreements, the Iran deal was 110 pages, is a treaty doesn't make it easy to look at reciprocal steps and pull back if necessary. It's a different kind of an instrument. So the Congress did get to decide on the Iran deal. It was an interesting process. And so I'm all for them having to take this as a treaty to the Senate, but they'll fail if they do so.
Joe, jump in.
Well, Richard Haas, treaties are, in fact, very difficult to pass through the United States Senate. But if a president wants something to survive his own presidency, isn't that exactly what's going to be required moving forward? Because if Donald Trump makes a decision on his own with North Korea, the next president's a Democrat, there are, of course, chances that that could be overturned. Again, it's difficult. It's supposed to be difficult, but isn't that what is required? So our allies, our friends and our enemies will know that there will be consistency in our foreign policy, regardless of who is sitting in the Oval Office.
In principle, I agree. It doesn't have to be in the form of a treaty. There's lower thresholds, just majority votes with executive agreements, which are probably politically more realistic. I like the idea of hearings on these issues, so the administration has to defend what it's done. What we had here in Singapore is not enough to subject to that process. It'd be the shortest hearing in history. You'd need a fleshed out agreement. And that's the sort of thing I agree with you, Joe. It ought to be presented if and when we ever get to that point, but that will require that Mike Pompeo and his colleagues do an enormous amount of negotiations about what the obligations are, about timelines, about verification. And I think there's real issues, again, about what we are prepared to put up there. And some people have criticized this for the lack of focus on human rights. That's a legitimate question. But I think even more legitimate are the other military threats that North Korea poses outside the nuclear. What about chemical? What about biological? What about artillery? What about special forces? And I think all of this needs to be thought through. We can't have a narrow concern just about nuclear weapons and long-range missiles, because that's all about us. And the South Koreans and the Japanese have legitimate interests in other threats posed by North Korea. But I agree with your basic point. This is exactly the role that Congress should be playing. They should be putting all this ultimately under a microscope. Right now, what they could do, by the way, is hold hearings and talk about what should go into an agreement rather than wait for one. Why doesn't Congress begin to shape the process? They don't have to just sit there for the next year or two. They could pass a resolution. They could have hearings. They could be basically giving ideas to the administration about what they want to see there in order for them to be prepared to approve it.
Ambassador Hill, there seems to be a growing consensus in Washington that Mike Pompeo is very capable as Secretary of State. I'm curious if you've heard the same thing, if you have confidence that Secretary Pompeo will be a good representative for the United States to have leading these talks, leading these negotiations.
Well, first of all, he's engaged the Foreign Service in a way that his predecessor did not. So I think that's very good news. I must say, looking at this statement, I'm a little worried about it, and I'd sort of like to know how that all happened.
Thanks for checking out MSNBC on YouTube, and make sure you subscribe to stay up to date on the day's biggest stories. And you can click on any of the videos around us to watch more from Morning Joe and MSNBC. Thanks so much for watching.